Hi, I'm Danielle Hartman, and welcome to another episode of Poured in PA, the series exploring Pennsylvania's craft beer industry. In this episode, we're off to Philadelphia, home to the American lager and home to a new yeast strain discovered by students at University of the Sciences. Philly Sour is changing the way sour beers are brewed.
Yeast is one of the major four ingredients in beer. Hops always rise to the surface as a major flavor contributor, but yeast is right there behind it in a major driver of beer flavor. Take, for example, a wit versus a lager versus a pale ale versus an English ale. All of those underlying flavors, with some exceptions, are from the yeast. We recognized an opportunity to innovate beer flavor by trying to identify new yeasts that can contribute new flavors to beer. The USciences is predominantly an undergraduate institution with some graduate programs. I have a research lab. I need to engage undergraduates in research, many of whom are not 21. So one way that I've been able to engage students who are under 21 in brewing science work is through a more microbiology related project where we go out into the environment. We try to sample trees and fruits and leaves for wild yeast. We bring those wild yeast back into the lab. We're able to isolate them, culture them, characterize their fermentation ability, and identify them, and ultimately see if they might be of some merit and some use in the brewing industry. So in our microbiology of beer lab, we're doing the same project. We call it Yeast Hunters, in which students learn aseptic technique, they learn how to culture yeast, they learn how to make agar plates, maintain their cultures, identify their yeasts, and evaluate their ability to make a decent beer. And that's how we found Philly Sour. We found Philly Sour many years ago, and it was an undergraduate student working in my lab. He went out to some local parks and was sampling some trees. This particular sample came from a dogwood tree, and the lab designation was called GY7B. It was the 7th isolate. It was a mixed culture, and this was strain A. We've since identified that yeast as a non-Saccharomyces yeast. Our typical brewer's yeast, our Saccharomyces cerevisiae. GY7B, or now called Philly Sour, is not a Saccharomyces yeast. It's actually of the class of Lallemand. We think it's a novel species, and most importantly, it makes a really good beer. When we go out into the field and we pull back samples to try to find yeast, we end up pulling a sample like bark into a sterile baggie. We'll then put a piece of that sample, like bark, into wort and let it ferment. Sometimes we see good fermentation activity, sometimes we don't. Those samples which show good fermentation activity, we will then plate onto a nutrient agar media so that we can isolate the yeast for further characterization and identification. Once we've isolated the yeast, we'll then put it back into wort and evaluate its ability to ferment again, now as a pure culture. We were really shocked and surprised with GY7B because it was producing a much more acidic beer than standard beers, approaching ranges that are traditional for sour styles. It's very rare for a yeast to produce substantial amounts of acid. At first I thought it was infected or it was contaminated. It was an aseptic technique. We made a mistake. It got contaminated with lactic acid bacteria, for example. But in fact, after some more lab analysis, it was the yeast doing all the heavy lifting. It was making both lactic acid and alcohol. We were always, every step of the way, shocked with how good the beer was that it was making. We then started pitching it to potential collaborators. One of the interested parties was Lallemand. They were able to then get a sample of at the time, GY7B, and put it in their own lab. Part of their process would have been doing what we did, validating its identity, validating its fermentation capabilities, but then also making sure that they could step it up into even bigger and bigger volumes and then undergo the process of producing a dry yeast. So that was completely out of our hands. That took a couple years on Lallemand's side, and it was an interesting time for me because I didn't know what was happening. It was a really exciting email that I got then from our collaborators that said that everything was going really well and they were excited to move it forward. People have been very interested in sour IPAs because one of the reasons why sour IPA is challenging to make is that traditionally lactobacillus, a bacteria, was used to sour the beer. Lactobacillus are particularly sensitive to hops. And so the presence of hops in an IPA would effectively kill or disable the lactobacillus bacteria and prevent the acid production. Philly Sour doesn't have any of those limitations, so you could make whatever beer style you wanted and ferment it like you would ferment any other beer with any other yeast. It just happens to also produce acid and making it sour. One of the really interesting things about Philly Sour is it never fails to sour.
First two beers we made with it were sour IPAs, and I found that the outcome, if I said, here's this sour I made for you, you might say, it's all right, it's okay for sour. And if I said this is an IPA, you'd be like, I guess it's kind of an IPA. But if I just said, here's this new style of beer I made, I'm not telling you anything about it, you'd be like, this is delicious. And that was my takeaway from it, that I loved both the beers we made with the sour IPA style, and they really just drank in a very unique way. I know like everyone likes to put this juice terminology towards IPAs, which, you know, take it or leave it. But those beers literally tasted like juice because they had the tartness and consistency of actual juice. And I think the hop flavors and aromas, I think they were enhanced. And so I really like those styles. And then the other one we made, we just used it for souring to do a fruited sour.
It's definitely a unique yeast in that you don't have to kettle sour. You can, you put it in your fermenter, within 2 to 3 days it sours down, and then the fermentation process takes over. And then within 10 days you can get it out and into your bright tank and have it on tap within, we'll say, 2 weeks.
It's also pretty versatile in that we've made beers with it that are under 5%, and then we've made beers with it that, like the beer that we have on currently, is 6.8%. So it's a nice yeast in that you can really get a nice strong beer, like alcohol-wise, or you can do something that's more sessionable. And both times you get this really delicious tart flavor out of it.
Having a souring yeast that you don't have to worry about infection later from is incredibly appealing because it makes it just easier to work with a product to achieve a flavor profile without having to be concerned about like infection in packaging or anything like that. So we made a sour IPA with it. It mimicked a lot of the same characteristics that you would find from a kettle sour. So it was still a fairly clean fermentation, but gave us that good low pH that really complemented and worked well with customer ideas of what that beer should be. So yeah, we've had really great experience with it and are looking forward to using it more in the future.
When people get the Philly Sour, though, it is great to tell them, like, this sour was actually like the yeast used to make this sour was discovered in a graveyard in West Philadelphia. That's like always blows people's minds. They're like, what?
Yeah.
It is pretty awesome that the University of Sciences is doing that program to discover these different yeasts. It just, really lends itself to the whole, idea that this whole culture is still evolving.
I mean, we're still learning a ton about that yeast also. It's not recommended, but we tried to repitch the yeast in a beer recently. Yeah. And it didn't re-sour, but it came out with like a nice flavor.
Sort of along the lines of Belgian, yeah.
Yeah, Belgian, almost somewhere between like a wit and a saison. So we threw it on nitro and just did 2 kegs of it just to see what kind of response we got back, and yeah, the customers have loved it.
Anytime I see Philly Sour on the market, I try to help represent it. I try to get some samples and taste because we're still learning more and more about it, learning about certain styles that it does particularly well with. It's a yeast that not only produces lactic acid and alcohol, but it has its own flavor and characteristics to it. So there are some fruit additions, some styles that I think it benefits, and maybe some others that it doesn't play as big of a role in flavor contributions. There was a lot of work that went into isolating this strain and getting it to market, and the university wanted to be able to continue the success of our research in that regard. So one way that we can drive funding for this type of work is through patenting and the licensing process. So we did file a patent on the production of sour beer using Philly Sour as a strain. It was licensed by Lallemand, and a small portion of proceeds from the sale of Philly Sours get returned to the university and funds our research. Philly Sour was the unicorn. We have isolated hundreds, probably in the 2000s, different strains over the last 6 years. To some degree, we get interesting yeasts that are capable of fermentation, but this was the real eye-opener, the real eureka in the moment that this is really something special. So I've seen a lot of uptick in interest from home brewers, from commercial brewers, in trying to do their own hunts. It's hard. It's been a lot of work, and we were really fortunate to find Philly Sour.
With the growing popularity of craft beer, quality control is becoming more important. University of the Sciences is doing its part to support the industry and educate the next generation of craft beer professionals.
The Brewing Science Certificate program at USciences started in 2015. We recognized a need for formal training for brewers in the state and surrounding state. It's an 18-credit graduate certificate. It teaches hands-on production, quality, and consistency. I'm the founder of the program. I started with research. I consider myself an academic brewer. I was a longtime hobby home brewer who had the good fortune to be able to pull some of my academic research into practical brewing applications. I started presenting at industry meetings like the Master Brewers Association, started meeting other educators in brewing, and realized that there was a real shortage of trained professionals. I'll never forget a conversation with Tom Kehoe at Yards where he said, if I lose a brewer, it will take me months to find a qualified applicant to fill a position. And so that was part of the inspiration for putting together a formal program to help folks find jobs and to help brewers find employees.
The Brewing Science program at USciences wanted to develop a system that can help local industry people have testing, and there's nothing in Pennsylvania. The other states have testing labs, but there's nothing in Pennsylvania that helps support the beer industry and the other malt beverage industries. So that was what Matt and a small committee put together to help build the malt beverage testing lab. They just realized that people were sending in samples or asking questions to Matt that really would have been better answered by a lab with analytical or microbiological testing. So there is a need in the industry for something as simple as alcohol testing to what's going on in our beer, what's living in our beer, and also it's more of an education thing because people just want access to beer science knowledge without necessarily having to pay for the rigorous course load. We lump it into different categories, so we have some malt and hop-based services, which aren't just for the hop industry and the malt industry, also for the brewers to kind of keep analysis going for those products. We also do a lot of yeast training, but also microbiological work, so we tell you if there's something in your beer, or potentially if you think you have an issue. And then we also offer analytical testing, which is a lot of the stuff that even breweries that have a lab. I came from a brewery that had a lab. I built that lab at 2SP Brewing Company. I didn't have the capabilities to do IBU testing, acidity testing, haze testing. We do those kind of things, but the big one that a lot of people come to us analytically is ABV, because you have a very small window, and a lot of people are putting adjuncts and fruits into their beers, and there's a chance of re-fermentation. So that's the services that are the main bread and butter, and then we have sensory training and also sensory analyses, which a lot of brewers do, but they don't maybe do in a formal way. And then lumping it all together, a big service that we just launched is actually a stability test, which kind of combines all the areas. It combines comprehensive plating with everything else that can change in your beer over the course of a month, from IBU to alcohol to color to CO2. Our purpose as a nonprofit, first and foremost, is to help educate and help promote people's brands and promote better quality beer, not just in Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, New York even, Maryland, there's other labs in the countries that treat it more as a profit industry. We're a nonprofit through an academic. So our focus really is to support the industry first. So, yeah.
The majority of our students are coming to us with already a bachelor's degree. They are interested in the brewing industry either as a career change, they're already working in the industry and they're looking to build their skill set. We get requests from brewers fairly frequently looking for talent, and we can't fill all of the requests. Chances are very high that a student that does well in our program, who's motivated and committed to working in the industry, we can get them a job. And it goes beyond that. We really try to work with students so that they can find the type of job in the brewing industry that they're interested in. For example, some of our graduates have gone on to start quality programs at breweries, for example, 2SP or Tonewood. The directors of quality there were graduates of our program who stepped into that position and were able to build out that lab at the conclusion of their training here. But then we also have a lot of other production brewers, assistant brewers, cellarmen and women as well that come out of the program. And in addition, some folks who've started their own breweries. So again, we try to align some of the topics, some internship experiences with what their career objectives are.
I majored in photography, conceptual art photography. After college, was shooting weddings and doing events, and it really wasn't my thing, but I was drinking beer, making homebrewed beer, and a couple local breweries I would go when they had beer releases, and I would just bring my camera and take pictures. Got noticed by a couple of them. They hired me to do some photographs and stuff for their websites and whatnot. And then one brewery took a chance on me and hired me as an assistant brewer back in 2014. I worked under a good crew, and then eventually moved on to be a production brewer at Neshaminy Creek up in Croydon. From there, I was enrolled in the brewing science program at USciences, and through Matt got an internship which led to a job at 2SP Brewing in Aston, Pennsylvania, and they needed to build a lab, so I built a lab from the ground up. And I found in the brewing science program just like more of a passion for the biological side of brewing, and it was more interesting and more hands-on, just like when I was working with film photography in college. It was so hands-on to test beer and to see your end result come out with information that you didn't have beforehand. So yeah, totally different path than what I expected a decade ago when I was graduating from college, but that's how life is sometimes, right? So
the brewing industry is way behind in quality. Because beer is inherently food safe, the pH of beer or the acidity of beer is no known pathogens can grow in beer because of its acidity. As a result, there hasn't been a lot of focused attention by the FDA or the TTB, for example, on beer. And I think then there hasn't been pressure on brewers to ensure a consistent, stable product.
There's just so many ways you can make your product better. Learning how to properly manage your yeast, learning how to properly reach your target ABV, your target IBU, your target colors every single time will give you that peace of mind, but also that comfort level to know that you're doing something right. If you want to save tens of thousands of dollars, spending just a tiny bit of money to just give you that peace of mind to know that your product is safe. The big rule is if it costs less than it would cost to dump the beer, then why not? It's like the cheapest insurance that you don't have to sign up for it month to month. And then on top of it, if you realize and you use our services and you realize, hey, we're not hitting our final gravities, or we are hitting our final gravities and we're going too high in alcohol, you could save money in the long run, not just on serial repitching of yeast, with our yeast management consultation, but also I've had a company reach out to me to do nutritional analysis and found out that their alcohol was a little too high on their seltzer products. So now they're saving themselves a couple $100 a brew by cutting out some malt. Our focus really is to support the industry first.
One reason why I think quality is rising more to the surface is the Brewers Association and other associations have put more of a focus and emphasis on it. People are talking about it more, that's good. Second reason is cans have exploded on the market. I am a big advocate for not putting fermentables into cans that will explode. And then I think the third reason is competition. There is more and more beer on the market, and it's more and more the chance that if a consumer has a poor product, they're going to move on to the next product and never look back.
beer is not immune to the microbes that cause more than just exploding cans and, you know, some extra turbidity or some extra acidity. It could ruin a brand. It could ruin a reputation. There's nothing worse than having to reach out to like your largest distributor client and be like, listen, we need to buy all that beer back from you because we just found out that someone, you know, improperly canned our product and it was vulnerable. As a whole, I think it's one of the easiest things to overlook, which is quality, but quality is one of the most important aspects to consistency in your product.
Check out University of the Sciences in Philadelphia for more information about their brewing science program. Until next time. Cheers.